asked me if I would be interested to talk here, and I said, yes, of course. So, Greg has already mentioned that in my practice I felt that there's a certain kind of lack of kind of rigor, kind of reflection and creativity when it comes to sustainability. So after working for several years as an architect, I felt that I have to kind of step out of architectural practice and go into academia and try to find some kind of ways of how to address the problem of sustainability within architectural practices. So I, for quite a long time, did my PhD that I finished 2 years ago. And what I want to do tonight is to introduce a few kind of propositions from my PhD work. And I'm not saying that I know how to do it, but I think through my work I try to find a few rather conceptual kind of approaches, or partially also very pragmatic approaches. And these are actually aimed to kind of enact sustainability in a more kind of serious way, and also obviously that's aimed to create more impact. So what I will do, I will make certain kind of propositions, and partially they are also quite hypothetical because I haven't really had the chance yet to really test them in projects. But I finished my PhD, so I'm now teaching at the university, but I'm also interested actually in being involved actually in trying to bring my kind of PhD insights back into practice. And I hope that also after this presentation you can maybe engage in a discussion about what you think about these propositions, if you find them valuable, or if you think they are actually very, from an academic perspective, and have no value for actually doing architecture on the floor. So, let me start. I will start with kind of 3 images as kind of examples. So recently in The Guardian, the British newspaper, one of the headlines was PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, creates the most sustainable building in the world. Then also very recently, like I found this on LinkedIn kind of messenger, there was this kind of way where Philips also is kind of also doing the most sustainable building in the world, or one of the most sustainable buildings in the world. And also there are other companies who actually also kind of engage in these superlatives of being very sustainable. So one question that I kind of ask is, like, has this kind of widespread use of the sustainable adjective resulted in an almost complete erosion of meaning? And I think that sustainability by now has a kind of very important force become very important force in the commercial market, and so it's a kind of important driver for projects, while especially in the commercial market I think there's a certain kind of lack of critical engagement with sustainability. And I think what I'm so kind of what I would kind of question is like this kind of very confident project descriptions and claims, and I think many practices conceal a lot of the contestation and uncertainty about how actually find kind of pathways to kind of less destructible futures. I totally acknowledge that it's very difficult to kind of enact sustainability in design practice, but I crucially argue that it's more important to actually face these controversies and to engage into a discussion of what the problems actually are, than having these kind of very confident and positive kind of headlines that we just had. And also with experience from our design studio that we are doing is that very often we have discussions and then somebody say, okay, no, but this is more sustainable than this, or this is more sustainable. And what I'm actually proposing is actually to enter a different, to kind of step back and enter a kind of different mode of reflection. For me, I think that this kind of adjective sustainable architecture is pretty much not very helpful, because I think I think this looking at different kind of approaches, there's such a variety of what architects do with sustainability in their practice, and I think it's much more important to actually kind of unpack this term into a set of kind of steps that I will kind of explain a bit further. But just looking at kind of what kind of variety has been created in kind of relation to the concept of sustainability. So starting with works like Buckminster Fuller, who was even kind of active before the concept of sustainability became widely acknowledged, but I think he had a very kind of systemic kind of approach already, and then there are all these works of this kind of more high-tech school of Foster's and future systems, and then there's a lot of projects that actually kind of engages with very kind of green facade suddenly and starts to map some lawn on the surface, or the Angiadi pavilion that also has a very kind of circular kind of logic, or Rogers project for I think the Scottish Parliament that has a lot of kind of passive design strategies. So I think there's a certain kind of agreement among architects. There's a certain kind of agreement amongst architects that sustainability is an important topic, and that and I think there's also a certain agreement that the built environment plays a So I think there are two kind of consensus, like sustainability is important for architecture, and also that architecture plays a kind of key driver in questions of kind of environmental degradation and human well-being. And I think most people know buildings use like most of the energy, for example. And I think there's a lot of kind of contestation about how to actually understand the problem of the environment, or also social problems, or how to understand questions of well-being. And then also how to define these challenges, and then how to kind of which scales and time frames to take into account. Are we thinking here about the short term? Are we 40, or are we thinking about the next 30 years? And I think the contestation is also about how to align the different stakeholders in the project. So I think I would suggest to kind of to forget about sustainable. I think it's still important I think sustainability is an important concept, but I think the problem is that we have to engage into a more reflective mode what sustainable architecture actually might be or can be. Because I think that's also one of the criticisms that I have at these kind of first images, where then Phillips is saying, okay, we have the most sustainable building, is that it seems to be like, okay, we have this most sustainable building, so all problems are solved now. The kind of problem framing is also solved, so okay, we can stop thinking about it. And I think that's totally wrong, because I think there are a lot of issues that actually haven't, where architecture hasn't really found enough satisfying solutions in terms of questions of sustainability. So I suggest instead of speaking of sustainable architecture to kind of enter a different approach, and actually really explore what architects, engineers, clients and others actually do with the concept of sustainability in the everyday context of their design studios, offices and on site. So I think it's important also to shift the perspective not on buildings, but actually on the design practices that kind of assemble buildings. So what I've done in my PhD is that I kind of went back to these architectural laboratories and conducted a lot of kind of interviews and kind of analysis of different kind of design documents, and spoke to different stakeholders. So I spoke with kind of politicians, spoke with the minister responsible for the building codes. I spoke with several different architects, I spoke with engineers, I spoke with property developers, and actually I looked at 2 case studies in my work. So one, it's a bit old, it's so I looked at both case studies are part of the small London master plan that's directly at the Thames, opposite of the Tower of London, which was, the master plan was done by Foster and Partner, and most of the buildings on that master plan were also designed by Foster and Partners. And I looked at 2 projects. The first one of this master plan, in order to also look how certain kind of goals were kind of achieved in actual operation, and also at the latest one. So the first one is the GLA, Greater London Authority Headquarters, City Hall, which was built between 1989 and 2002. I thought that was an interesting case because the Greater London Authority in itself has a kind of constitutional obligation to kind of advance questions of sustainability. That's how what's kind of written in their kind of preamble. And also like famous architects like Norman Foster kind of obviously also brand their projects as kind of being potential for sustainable, virtually non-polluting building. And I thought, okay, these are kind of interesting claims, so let's see what they did. Let's forget about what they talk about, let's forget about their kind of actual promotional material, let's try to follow through, retrospectively kind of follow through the design process what they did. The second case is this building, part of the same master plan, also designed by Foster and Partners. It's for PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it was built between 2007 and 2010, and has been promoted as the most green building in the United Kingdom, most green office building in the UK, and also Foster and Partner kind of in the lower yellow kind of line, kind of ascribed as a kind of sustainable headquarters, and it achieved, it's the first building in the UK to achieve a BREEAM outstanding. Sometimes then also sustainability and eco-friendly, all these terms are kind of being used in kind of almost exchangeably, even though they are kind of quite different concepts partially. So I'm not going further into my kind of how I conducted my PhD, but I think I'm just trying to kind of extract a few propositions and hope we can engage in a discussion about this maybe afterwards. Or if you have a question in between, also I'm happy to interrupt me and pose your question. So proposition 1. So I think it's important to forget about the term of sustainable architecture, but first of all recognize that sustainability is a concept. And obviously as a concept, sustainability cannot be built in itself. So it's in order to kind of give meaning to sustainability in design practice, the concept needs to be transformed, displaced, modified. And yeah, so I think the interesting thing is that when you talk to different kind of people that are involved in the same project, that they're actually coming with totally different kind of answers what actually the challenge is. So I think then a lot of them kind of talk about zero, about carbon emissions, which obviously is a key kind of facet of sustainability in architecture, but it's also a lot of other questions. So you could also say, okay, it's also some call for some weird concept of nature, other kind of thematize pollution, others start to think about kind of social justice questions, others speak about the public space around or also within the building. So I think it's important to say, I think it's important to first of all say, okay, it's a concept, and there's a building, and there's a kind of design process that kind of somehow transforms, shifts the concept of sustainability. And I think instead of speaking that's a sustainable building, yes or no, because I think that's a discussion that leads nowhere. I think it's important to really kind of to pay attention to these kind of translations where the concept becomes modified in design practice. So I kind of in my PhD developed this kind of concept of translation that I didn't invent myself, but it's drawn on like a kind of social scientist, kind of Michael Cullen, and he kind of developed this in kind of 4 different steps. But I'm not going into detail now because I think it's leading something is I think it's the wrong kind of just taking too much time. It's maybe also not so interesting for tonight. But I think just on a very kind of basic level, I think there are kind of 4 kind of key steps that could be identified in this translation process. So I think it's first of all to kind of really pay attention of what actually the problems are that you, me or you would like to address with the kind of design process. And then I think then it's important to look how these become formulated into certain kind of design targets, how particular kind of design strategies are then composed, and in the end how the building becomes materialized. I come back to these questions, they're the same questions, but I come back to all of these 4 steps and try to give a few examples to give it a bit of meat, so it's not so theoretical. Okay, so I think what's important is that sustainability as a concept kind of emerged quite a long time ago already, and I think there's still a lot of people who kind of refer to this kind of totally overused kind of definition of sustainability, which is important, but it's also maybe important to recognize that it's quite long ago that this kind of definition has been kind of launched. And I think what is one of the key kind of contributions of the concept of sustainability is that it really made clear that kind of environmental or ecological issues cannot be addressed with also addressing other questions at the same time. So also it would be weird to not also address questions of kind of minimal, of kind of basic needs, or of certain kind of questions of justice, or I think it's important that sustainability brings certain kind of issues together and tries to solve them together, because it doesn't make sense to only look at them into isolation. I think that's also important, maybe because very often we then today have people who then start to speak about social sustainability or ecological sustainability, which, at least from my point of view, is kind of undoing this kind of achievement of sustainability a bit, because it's then again looking at kind of particular aspects in more isolation. So I think it's important to see that together. It's, I think, also important to recognize that obviously there has been a lot of kind of debate about the concept of sustainability until today. And I think until today, so within these 30 years, I think there's been a lot of criticism about that. There were kind of debates about is this notion of development actually kind of combinable with the question of sustainability, because they kind of almost apply to different directions. And I think there's a lot of there has been a lot of thinking in that field, so I think it's also important to recognize and not only come back to this initial definition of Brundtland, which is important but is 28 years old. And I think what is important is to kind of avoid these kind of vague notions where it's not really kind of specified what you want to kind of preserve, and also for whom you want to preserve something. So I think it's important when we try to enact, so let's not say we want to do a sustainable building, but I think it's important to say, okay, you recognize that architecture, that there are several kind of groups involved, and maybe you say there's certain kind of goals for the developer that we like to address, but maybe I think it's also important to specify also for which other groups you try to achieve certain things. And I think importantly, also, that's also why I work with this kind of headline of controversies. I think it's also clear that sustainability, when you try to bring it into practice, that it's not a thing that there's always a conflict, and there's always a struggle, and I think it's important to emphasize these struggles, but also then kind of have a discussion about these kind of differences and be clear about it. So I think it's also important to actually say, okay, this project or this kind of particular solution achieves that, but there are certain things we can't achieve, but to be clear about and not kind of just ignore these kind of of things that are actually being achieved and that are being not achieved. And then I think also it's very important that the context matters, and it's I think there are a lot of opportunities also that cannot be addressed in a very generalized way. So sustainability in particular concept might also mean something totally different, obviously. But I think, yeah, sometimes people think that I think there's a lot of opportunity by actually looking specifically what can be done in specific contexts. So just going back, Norman Foster, most as sustainable building, city hall. I think what's also important is that this kind of transformation from the concept into the building actually is so I frame them as kind of heterogeneous assemblages, because I think it's important also to overcome particular notions that sustainability might be a technical issue only, where you have to think about certain ways of heat coefficients of some certain kind of buildings and materials. Or I think it's important to understand that if you think about kind of how to give meaning to sustainability in design, but that's also valid for more design generally. I think that actually all these kind of different elements are being kind of muddled up in this kind of process. So I think it's very complex, but I think that's the only chance that we have to kind of face these different elements and not trying to ignore them. So it's a mixing up of politics, economics, scientific ways, questions of nature, different scales, questions of power, of justice, knowledge, humans, non-humans. So in my work I try to kind of map, not that I say I was able to capture what happened during this process, but I tried to at least kind of map when certain actors were kind of involved, where they named as kind of key kind of element. So this is a timeline going from left to right. The red horizontal lines are different phases when certain actors were involved. Below there's certain kind of design documents that were important, and the line here is when the building actually was finished. Because I think it's important to think about when certain actors are involved, because obviously only then they have the power to kind of change particular things or bring some agendas in. So key question at the beginning is, how are environmental and social issues defined? And I think this is also a question of knowledge production. How do we come to understand the environment out there? I always like to show this painting of from 1667. This is where Louis XIV sits in the middle of his kind of advisors, and they're having like several kind of maps and globes, and so I think there are at least 5 or 4 different globes and kind of books and maps, and I think it's important how we come to understand the world out there, and I think it's an important process also of actually how to begin with the question of sustainability. Because if we from the beginning think that sustainability is a question of BREEAM credits, and I think then we missed a couple of opportunities. Similar picture also is really important about how to understand the world. This is a picture that was very popular in kind of 70s and 80s environmental politics. So I think it's probably one of the pictures that has a lot of kind of political power, because there was a lot of kind of documents and showing the kind of so these are the first images from Apollo 8 from space on the planet Earth, and it shows planet Earth as a kind of suddenly as a very small planet in a dark black universe, and it suddenly looks very fragile and small and weak. And I think that kind of view back on the Earth's change was really important also as a way of understanding the environment out there, the planet, because from where we still thought the planet is a disk, it looked like it's kind of endless. And I think it's also important that the concept of sustainability involves like a really massive scope of different crises. And I think there are a lot of crises. They there's still a lot to do. So I think it's important to think about what are the many issues that can be involved. And I think, for example, of course it's about global warming, that's a key issue, but I think it's also about questions of, for example, of kind of contemporary forms of slavery, when you think about where these kind of production chains of certain kind of building materials come from. It is partially about kind of participatory kind of design processes. Maybe if you kind of are involved in a kind of communal kind of project, I think there's a kind of really big scope. And I think you shouldn't from the beginning kind of narrow that down into particular kind of best guidance principles that you find somewhere. So I kind of appeal to the creativity of architects to kind of think yourself about what the kind of what sustainability could mean for a particular project, and also try to see the different stakeholders what is going on, instead of kind of trying to kind of tick several kind of boxes. Have I lost you already, or are you still all good? So I think there's also, I still believe that there's a certain responsibility of designers to kind of not delegate away how to interpret the concept of sustainability. I mean, what I mean by delegate away is that for example, I was involved in a project, then I think we defined the kind of goals for our project by just checking certain kind of policy documents and what they kind of require. So we were checking the building regulations, and we were checking some kind of local borough documents, what they want. And so we kind of created a list on different kind of levels, and then I think that all became our agenda, what we have to achieve. But I think it's also important for the client actually to have somebody that might come up with a kind of different vision what sustainability could be, and also coming with kind of different indicators of actually how to address it. Okay, then the question is that, so when you clear what the issues are, what you want to do, then I think it's important how these challenges are then kind of transformed into particular design targets and goals. And this is a very old, this is a kind of Brian document of City Hall. And it's so I looked at these two kind of case studies, and interestingly, there were like totally different drivers of the project. So for City Hall, actually, Brian didn't play a role at all, while the other client, which was PricewaterhouseCoopers, like the entire project was driven by Brian. It's really about the questions. For PricewaterhouseCoopers is one of the top 4 kind of global business consultancies, and recently they also have a branch that is actually operating in the question of sustainability consultants. So they wanted to kind of give themselves a kind of playground, or like to kind of demonstrate their ambitions. So that's why they thought, okay, we developed this 7 more London building, this black building I showed at the beginning. And at that time, Brian Outstanding was just kind of launched, and they really wanted to get this Brian Outstanding. And I don't think that Brian in itself is a bad thing. I think it was really instrumental to kind of raise the awareness of sustainability in the built environment, but I think it can't be the kind of end goal of designers. I think you might agree that you start with a kind of Brian, that you say, okay, I do Brian, but I think it's also important to maybe think about what else might be important beyond Brian. So I think it's the starting point or the end point. Then I think we also have to understand that kind of from the kind of variety of diverse issues that Brian is kind of compressing the world out there, that we have to come to understand into particular credit areas, and so I think that kind of compresses the issues of the world into 9 categories, and then it kind of further compresses them into 87 possible credits, and I think that's also a bit dangerous. And I think also that it's a generalized system, and I think there's this kind of conflict between the general and the specific of a project, and I think there are a lot of kind of opportunities also that cannot be grasped with a kind of generalized system. And I think then obviously then when you have certain targets kind of formulated, then the question is how do you actually transform them into particular design strategies. And I mean, all of these kind of steps, it's very often that you have to go back and forth, and it's a very hard kind of negotiation process. So don't misunderstand me that it's kind of linear, but I think it's important to kind of ask these questions in order to kind of enter a more reflected discourse about, or also to kind of innovate in the design practice in that field. So there are obviously, this was a very instrumental diagram for the City Hall building, where they kind of really put a lot of emphasis on building form and envelope, like passive design strategy, and it became this, in the end it became this driver of this really weird shape of City Hall that you can see here in a kind of section. And I think for City Hall, I think that there are a lot of interesting kind of elements related to passive design, but I think these kind of broader questions of sustainability have been largely ignored. So I think for Foster and Partner, it became largely a question of energy efficiency in the entire project, and I think there was, so I spoke to several architects and engineers, I mean, after they decided they want to do a really low energy building, I think sustainability was not an issue that kind of appeared in the entire design process anymore. Then, so I think also when you think about how to find design strategies, I think it's also very often about how you frame particular things. So this is also of City Hall. It has this very complex shape. It's obviously not a box with 6 different sides or 5 different facades. It has, I think, 600 different facades that are different tilted in different directions. So it became actually quite complex to do kind of some energy analysis. I think there was in the City Hall process, there was such an obsession with that image, even though it shows that there are kind of fundamental problems with the shape. Because I think there was a lot of argumentation about having this round shape to minimize the surface, to minimize heat loss in winter, but at the same time, this weird shape created a lot of solar gains in the summer, because there was a lot of kind of perpendicular exposure to the sunlight, but I think that was kind of ignored. So I think sometimes there are these kind of very partial perspectives, but you forget that they have wide-reaching consequences in totally other ways of thinking about the problem. Then I think the last step is how are these kind of design strategies then kind of expanded and materialized. Because I think very often there are some kind of predictive claims, and then in the end I think most when you do compare like certain kind of environmental or other also kind of social parameters of certain projects that kind of guide design process, very often the actual projects they lag quite behind. So I think it's also important to then not very often I think there's a certain tendency when we see certain kind of diagrams to take this as a kind of, I think there's not enough questioning of certain kind of predictions that are happening. So I'm just trying to wrap this up a bit. So I think on the one hand it's important to look in this transformation from the concept of sustainability to the materialized building is to look at kind of key kind of displacement, key transformations, which for example for a project is to say, okay, sustainability, we kind of delegate our kind of intelligence away and we say, okay, we want 69 points of BREEAM. This is for me a key transformation in the process. And I think this kind of idea of transformation also implies always that there's always a shifting of our form of kind of betrayal in this process. There's never a translation that actually kind of is equal from what you have at the beginning and what we have later. So it's really important to pay attention to these kind of shifts. Then I think what's also really important is that there are very kind of different views between the kind of different design stakeholders. And I think especially about this kind of conflict between architects and building services engineers, for example. Because I think in both of the projects there was a kind of big struggle about certain kind of ratios of glass. And I think it's just important to pay attention that there are different kind of expertises at work, so they have different educations, but they also importantly have different kind of responsibilities in the project. And I I think it's very much it's important to pay attention of how these kind of different kind of responsibilities and expertise and interests how they actually kind of negotiated, and also how they are settled between them. Because it's in the end it's a kind of power game with a kind of better argument. Very often architects also overrule certain kind of advisors. For example, for this this headquarters in London, this black building, they still have a kind of fully glass facade all around. Nonetheless, it won the kind of BREEAM outstanding award. And I think there was a lot of the environmental engineers that were quite against it, but the architect from Foster Partner just said, we love glass, we want a glass building. And so I think it's important to pay attention to these different views, interests, and responsibilities. And maybe as a third kind of concluding remark, I think yes, it's again important to look at these kind of differences between projected design, what we do in the studio, what kind of hypotheses we are doing, because predicting the future is actually quite a tough business. And I think there are a lot of kind of elements that actually might, in actual operation, take influence that are very different to predict. And because very often for example, in solar analysis, so we try to frame a particular aspect of a building through certain parameters, but it might be that totally other parameters might come in. For example, the client who suddenly decides to use a building in a totally different way. And so I think it's also just important to be a bit careful about certain kind of possibilities to predict certain performances and not say, okay, this building will do this and this and this. But I think it's important also to acknowledge that it's a very tough business to kind of make certain performance predictions. To kind of re-emphasize this kind of two words. So this is part of a facade drawing, and then obviously there is all the kind of technical detailing, and there were like certain arguments why the facade looked that way, or three kind of key factors. But in the end, I think there was a lot of other issues that actually was also involved in the facade design, that they couldn't be, that the facade design of City Hall was so complex that they couldn't clean these kind of lamellas there. And I think it's a very interesting, this kind of abstracted world and the real world. And I think it's also something we should not forget. And that's and I would be happy if you have any questions, or say, okay, this is totally useless, or you find that interesting. I would be happy if you have a small debate. Thank you.
Definitely, that's why we're here. So there's a first question that we have to pass on the mic. Anyone? Yeah.
Whatever happens, we can adapt, but if we accepting a lot of measurement. And in the context of urban design and architecture, do you feel it also is about the vision framework?
Very good. Understand that.
Like within the context of urban design and architecture, I'm just curious what is your opinion on
I don't know if everybody understood the question. So it was about resilience and urban design or architecture. I think basically I'm very slightly critical about this kind of becoming fashionable idea of resilience. Because I think I have the impression that people are kind of quite bored and tired of sustainability, and I think they're kind of coming up with almost a new concept. I think actually for me, a lot of questions of resilience I think there's also a certain way of accepting a certain status quo where you kind of react more on things that already occur. And I think this, I mean, you can maybe, you could frame maybe sustainability through kind of different strategies. And one of them is, I think, a resilience strategy. But I think we shouldn't forget also about certain strategies to kind of prevent things even happening. So basically, I think there are quite a lot of kind of urban theorists who said, okay, we are not interested in sustainability anymore, we are doing resilience strategies. And I think, I think, yeah, that's a bit, I think it's just like you didn't manage to solve one problem and then you're just starting with a new kind of framework. But I think that resilience for me is part of sustainability, but I think resilience doesn't cover all aspects of sustainability. So I, for my work, prefer to work through the lens of sustainability. Somebody opinion on resilience?
Difficult one. Maybe to just throw another question into the mix. So I'm curious to hear maybe a little bit of how you're teaching, let's say, aspects of sustainability in the studio. Because in some way you're proposing to, let's say, redo, or let's say, badly you need to reconceptualize how we design it. We need to start from the end of sustainability somehow. I mean, because I had no teaching about sustainability in my architectural education. Right? So, but if that should be the starting point, or at least if it should be the ground for any activity when we build it, then we also need to really look at the education.
Yes,
or not.
Definitely. But it's interesting because sustainability is not a kind of topic that is actually new. And so I think if I speak for myself, I'm trying to kind of bring this from very different angles somehow. So, for example, this graduation studio is one example of trying to get a better grip on sustainability. And I think maybe they should rather speak than me. I think sometimes I'm kind of repeating myself. I think it's very difficult, I think, to not become cynical about it, yeah, but I think there are at least a few of these things that I also proposed here today. I think for me, so I always argue, so I don't want to hear this is more sustainable, but I think it's really about making a better argument, yeah, and to kind of be very precise about what are the actual challenges that you want to kind of address with your project. So the graduation studio is one that kind of tests or one field where we're trying to make a difference and try these kind of particular proposals in design proposals. And I think that's why also these kind of controversies are important, actually to kind of face them. Now let's not pretend it's easy, and let's not pretend there is a lot of incomplete knowledge as well. I think if you, for example, think about building materials, there are these kind of diverse kind of labels, but there are still a lot of questions open. I think it's important to acknowledge. But there's also a different form. So I started with a colleague a kind of round table discussion where we always invite different design practitioners. So it's really about what I kind of had the last kind of proposition about these different professions, because that's what our I see really one of the key strugglers. And that may be also the kind of client, and that may be some occupier. I think it's important to bring them together on the table, and I think this kind of round table discussions, they are also, the goal of the round table discussion is kind of open-ended, but it's about to try to test certain things, to discuss them, and I think that's a different kind of format. And then there's also particular courses where we kind of emphasize. It's a new course I'm starting where also we try to unpack what particular projects similar to my PhD. We do that as a practice and see how they give meaning to sustainability. We have also the different kind of design stakeholders in the lectures and speaking about their kind of
should be transformed and it's a concept that should be changed. It's not true that maybe sustainability is just a word we use to address in a nice way the project, but at the end we should name the things as they are and not as sustainable, because it's concerns so many things that at the end, from my point of view, we don't know what is sustainable. Like, it's better to, I don't know, say zero energy building, or I don't know, something more precise, from the starting, for the beginning, and not saying sustainable. No? I don't know.
Obviously, that's also sort of a slight provocation if I try to erase this adjective. Because I mean, I'm still convinced that sustainability is an important concept, but I totally agree that I think it's important to say what we are trying to be more precise about, what we are trying to achieve. So what are the key challenges that we want to address? And if this is a kind of questions of carbon emission, then I think that's a clear statement. I think it's also more productive. But then let's not pretend that this is solving a lot of other issues as well. I think it's just like that I feel uncomfortable with these kind of first three images that I showed, like, because I think somehow it suggests to me like, okay, we are on track. It's the most sustainable building. Sustainability kind of problem is closed. Can close the box and can start exploring new kind of problems. And I think that's very critical. And I think it's important. I think there are still a lot of issues not kind of addressed. And I think especially, as I said, like I think it's important to become more creative about what the challenges are. Also, particularly think about the different people who are involved in one project. I think it's too much when you talk then about certain benefits, but you're not clear enough, like who are these benefits for and who is actually might really lose on this process. I think it's good to be more clear about it.
So at the end, use the sustainability word and specify that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there was a question behind you or next to you.
My reading, as I I was reading before 1 month ago that we want to meet the growth of the population after 20 years from now. Every day we should build like 500 buildings every day. So the crisis is becoming, and we should be aware about that. Some movement, like I will give you a hint about Zeitgeist movement. Peter Joseph, he was talking about that before. It was 2008 Venus Project. But there is like a conspiracy about that. Some kind of conspiracy that everything is according to politics. No one can do this project. Nobody can, go to the real meaning of sustainability of our planet. So this is a real crisis, and I want you to give me a good answer about that.
I think that's what I'm trying to make clear here. I think there is no real meaning. And I think it's important to understand that it's very contested and it's also very context specific. So there is no general kind of guideline. And I think that's also why when I now practice, I was confronted with a lot of kind of guidelines on what to do, and I just felt like I really wanted to know where they're coming from. And so I thought, and I felt I can't do it out of my kind of practice to kind of address these questions with a bit more kind of intelligence. But I think it's important to not predict that it's clear what sustainability in architecture is. I think it's pretty clear what sustainability is as a concept, but I think then it's important to what sustainable architecture then is, how to give meaning to it. I think it's important to make clear it's not clear, and let's kind of face that. I think it's much more productive than decide, okay, we did the most sustainable project here. But I think obviously, and that's a very important dynamic. This kind of population growth, and also one thing that I maybe didn't say now as one of my kind of propositions, but I think it's especially for kind of the kind of rich Western cultures. So speaking most where I come from, also, it's also I think it's important to question our own ways of living and our lifestyles, and I think we somehow also have to kind of de-accelerate, and I think we, in relation to architecture, also have to think about how particular forms of design can maybe kind of produce worlds that are more kind of livable and more kind of desirable. And but I think it's also doesn't work. I think without also giving something up. I mean, if you have a big flat and you fly on the weekend there and have a nice week holiday, I think that's also on the level of architecture. I think it's important to that we have to give up things. I think it's not that can go on and you can solve all these problems with kind of particular technologies or shifting strategies. I think it's also about rethinking our own values, kind of rethinking what kind of luxury for us means, also rethinking how we are happy. So I didn't answer your question, but
hello. I came in a little bit late, so my question you may have already answered or addressed it, but this last question is relevant. What would be your definition of sustainability as an architect, designer, engineer? In one sentence, to you, what is sustainable?
Context specific and being very precise of what I want to sustain for whom. I think that's because I think there is no general definition of. It's really about the particular cases, and I think then it's important to be very specific what you want to achieve, who loses in the process. But I think generally it's very difficult to be clear about it.
So it really varies from project to project, from a small scale versus large scale. And my next question would be, the projects that have been taken on and finished already by many years, have they rendered the ideal promise that they had proposed? In other words, the resources, the energy, the materials, everything, the budget that went into this project versus what is returned as far as energy returns or budget returns or long-term longevity. Do you think, what would be the project? In general, do you think the projects do return these investments, or how is it standing the test? How are these projects withstanding the test of that? Do we have any results to understand? Or is it still a projection?
I think also in general that's a question that cannot be answered. But I think there's a lot of kind of post-occupancy analysis of buildings, and they largely, hugely kind of stay and kind of achieve the results that are often hugely behind what was actually kind of predicted by engineers, architects. And so I think that's quite worrying actually. But I think obviously there might also be projects that are, but I think a lot of projects actually don't achieve their goals. But it's very difficult for me to make a kind of informed position here without speaking about a particular process. So for example, for City Hall, I looked also at the kind of occupation. That there are certain claims that actually could never be verified, because the building management never generated the particular data. So it was about a particular cooling system that only takes 25% of its energy, but they never kind of measured what this cooling system actually uses. So let's face it, it's not clear. It cannot, even some questions could not be even verified. There were kind of 5 kind of key design targets, and 2 were achieved, and 2 were not achieved, and 1 was couldn't be answered. Yeah, so there's a lot of things also really unclear of how to. There's a lot of incomplete knowledge. I think it's important to just understand that as well.
Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll tell you